Good morning. Could everybody hear me okay? We're good. All right. So welcome to this morning's discussion of Psyfeld. We could jump right into it. Anybody have any thoughts, observations about what they saw or what they would like to talk about with regard to the episode? Anybody want to pick a particular character to start with?
I can start. So I think I made a few notes about Kramer, and I actually don't know his friend's name. I think it's something with an M. It's like
Newman?
Newman. Okay, close enough. So I think kind of their shared interactions, I kind of think of as like a shared psychosis, like a manus virtu. I never can pronounce the French word for it. That they're like they're both sharing in this delusion that they have this like excellent idea, and nobody else seems to interact with the people with the, it's like a tuk-tuk or something like that.
So what we're discussing here is shared psychotic disorder, the French term, which I don't think you have to actually recall, because if it will be used on an exam, especially an exam like the shelf exam, is likely to be in parentheses, and that is folie à deux. This is a condition where there is an individual with a pre-established mental disorder, psychotic, suffering from a delusion. And at this time, if you're going to look at this particular episode as a case study, any guess on your part, any thought about which of these two individuals might actually have that pre-established delusion?
So I certainly think Kramer is like the pre-established delusion, and then Newman is like feeding into that shared delusion.
Okay, so the idea of shared psychotic disorder really doesn't address then what Kramer's primary illness is. What shared psychotic disorder really captures is that, and it's an individual, in this case it would be Newman, who is in close context with Kramer, begins to develop aspects of Kramer's delusional system. And for us, that would mean the fixed belief about the rickshaw business, or whatever you want to call it, with regard to what they're doing in New York. So that's the general theme here. If that is the case, there are a couple things that usually come up in standardized exams pertaining to shared psychotic disorder, pertaining to folie à deux. Any guesses, any thoughts, anything that you've seen in maybe board review that comes to mind with regard to characteristics, certainly characteristics that students can be tested on? Number one is that the delusion in the second case, and that would be Newman, is usually milder, if you will. It's not as severe. It may not be as functionally impairing as it is in the index case. The other thing that often comes up is that individuals with this condition, or at least the relationship, usually is established in someone who is of a superior position, usually a parent. And the second case is usually dependent in some way. So if this turns out to be shared psychotic disorder, it may tell us a lot about Newman's relationship with Kramer. And the truth is that more times than not, when these two friends get into trouble, when we see functional impairment as a result of their behavior, and that includes their shared behavior, it is Newman who is usually the partner in crime, if you will. It's usually Kramer's ideas that get them into trouble. So, interesting take on this relationship. Maybe it is shared psychotic disorder. If it was, what's one thing that, not in this episode, but maybe in a subsequent episode with their continued relationship, or at least these continued characters, we may observe? How do you treat shared psychotic disorder?
Don't you need to separate them?
Exactly right. So, what you would see in a subsequent season, hypothetically, is that these two would be separated. And upon separation, we would not expect Kramer to improve. We wouldn't expect Kramer to improve only if he would be treated for whatever his primary psychotic disorder is. On the other hand, Newman would improve. Unfortunately,
Oh, yeah.
because these relationships are usually long-standing, even separation is usually temporary. And when reunited, uh, and especially when the symptoms remain active in the index case, folia do is reestablished. So that's something that is unfortunate, especially when we're looking at a parent. And this illness is seen in the context of the parent-child relationship.
Dr. Toby, I have a question about that. So while Kramer does seem to be the one who has the initial delusion, it does seem like Newman is actually the one who is a little bit more dominant. Like when they're taking, when the two of them end up with the rickshaw, Newman is the one who ends up sitting in it while Kramer is the one driving it. And you can kind of tell from the beginning of the reaction, like the interaction, that it was always going to go that way.
That is true. That is true. So let me, from a pure diagnostic perspective, provide the opinion that I don't think this is shared psychotic disorder. It certainly is a relationship, and there is a subplot in this particular episode that allows for the discussion of this illness. But this is not shared psychotic disorder. I think shared psychotic disorder is something that in one way is a little bit overblown, but from a different perspective, and that's the perspective, the actual dynamic itself is largely underrepresented, and I can get to that in just a little bit. Beyond this episode, I mean, this is a pre-established relationship. I mean, these two have known each other for a while, aka previous seasons. The trouble they get into is usually, again, more as a partner than it is an established slash subordinate or dependent. And largely because of that, and therefore, and consequently, because of the role that Newman really plays, it really does go against, as per your observation, true shared psychotic disorder. So more of a prompt to discuss the illness, but it does fall somewhat short of truly diagnosing folia do or shared psychotic disorder. This type of process, this dynamic, may occur in groups beyond the dyad. So 3 people, folie à trois. Still shared psychotic disorder. The French name does change. It could occur in families. And it also could occur in individuals who, similar to Kramer and Newman, simultaneously. So there is the absence of a pre-established case, but there are 2 equal cases, and perhaps this is what's really going on here. 2 equal cases where the delusion is actually established, one feeds on the other, and it doesn't really go from a pre-established to a dependent. And perhaps that's what's going on here. The other thing that we have to focus on here is the idea of the delusion itself. So this condition is focused on someone with a pre-established delusion, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. A delusion is a fixed belief that is rigid, meaning that it is not altered when the individual is presented evidence to the contrary. If this condition, if the conditions, plural, change, and the individual does demonstrate some level of insight, that thought deficit is not going to be labeled a delusion. It's going to carry a different label. If it's not functionally impairing, the label that you will usually hear psychologists and psychiatrists use is the overvalued idea, right? So the overvalued idea is, in fact, a deficit in thought content. However, it is not fixed. And by definition, the individual does demonstrate insight, and enough insight where that deficit is not functionally impairing. Think of the overvalued idea as the complete opposite spectrum, or on the complete opposite side of the spectrum relative to the delusion. And if you were to connect the dots now, and if you were to look at intermediate conditions or deficits, they go by several different names. These intermediate forms, unlike the overvalued idea, are in fact clinically significant, but unlike the delusion, are not fixed. So they do impair functioning, but the individuals do actually demonstrate some degree of insight, therefore marking them as intermediate between the overvalued idea and the delusion. They would include ruminations, preoccupations, and obsessions. And they're really in no given order, and the terms are relatively used interchangeably. Okay, so again, mildest form defined through their not being clinically significant would be the overvalued idea. The most severe form, hallmarked by clinical significance as well as rigidity, is the delusion, and then intermediate, clinically significant, but with some degree of insight, therefore non-rigid, are the ruminations, the preoccupations, and the obsessions. Okay, now, having said that and provided you that background with regard to deficits in thought content, an individual can have an obsession. Matter of fact, they can actually have obsessive compulsive disorder. So not only is there an obsession identified as a deficit in thought content, but it is clinically significant, and their clinical impairment results in the diagnosis of OCD, right? So fairly straightforward here. That obsession, when demonstrative in a person who is in close context with someone else, maybe someone who is dependent, can lead to that person also beginning to develop the obsession as well, the intrusive thought. So in this case, the thoughts are not delusions, but we can see the mechanism in play. The American Psychiatric Association does not designate shared obsessive compulsive disorder or shared obsession disorder. That doesn't exist. Despite the fact that this could be clinically significant, it is really not captured by the American Psychiatric Association through the DSM, nor is shared rumination disorder, nor is shared preoccupation disorder, right? So lighter forms, milder forms of the delusion certainly do exist. And the dynamic with regard to two or more people sharing these lighter forms, these milder forms also exist, but there is no established diagnosis. You are not going to see this on a shelf exam. So in one way, shared psychotic disorder, at least the dynamic, is underrepresented, but you're going to see this. You're going to see individuals who become part of a group or a class and come out of that class with pretty quasi-rigid beliefs through that class. And they're going to be a different person. They're going to be changed in some way upon completion of that class, whether it's an undergraduate class, whether it's the current class everybody's taking now, starting this morning, etc. So And of course, I could use the class outside of academics too. Shared non-psychotic disorder, if you will. It's a very, very prevalent mechanism. All right. Any other thoughts with regard to Kramer and Newman? Any other characters? We want to talk about any other behaviors you identified as interesting?
Well, I'd definitely say that one of the kind of the themes in this episode is like defiance of social norms and rules.
Certainly is a hallmark characteristic of what disorder?
Antisocial.
Right, and I think that's where we would need to start with regard to describing, or at least making sense of Uncle Leo's behavior, right? Antisocial personality disorder, and in a flashback or a dream of Jerry's, where Uncle Leo is doing pull-ups, there is an allusion to a film called Cape Fear that is about an individual not only with antisocial personality disorder, but likely psychopathy. And there's a bit of a difference between these two terms. One is a clinical diagnosis. Antisocial personality disorder has set criteria that, if reached, diagnoses. It's a diagnostic term. It diagnoses a mental disorder. It diagnoses mental illness. Psychopathy is not quite there. You will not be able to look in the DSM and look at and find, or look for and find, diagnostic criteria for psychopathy. So it is not a clinical diagnosis. It is it's a clinical term. The difference is that, at least the consensus is that psychopathy is a more severe form of antisocial personality disorder. And unlike antisocial personality disorder, which in and of itself is very difficult to treat, psychopathy is considered to be even more treatment resistant. Individuals with psychopathy do not need, despite the fact that they may often have, they do not require the diagnosis of conduct disorder prior to the age of 15. And then, above all else, there are some signs and symptoms that are used to describe psychopathy. In the Hare Behavioral Inventory, Hare, H-A-R-E, was the forensic psychiatrist that identified this variant, if you will, of the antisocial personality that distinguish it from the antisocial personality disorder. And I'll post those signs and symptoms on Instagram later today. Right? The idea there is that if you look at the actual checklist, if you will, of psychopathy, it contains a lot of bullets that overlap with the antisocial personality. But it also contains bullets that are not part of the definition of the antisocial personality. And that's where the idea comes, or at least that captures the idea, that psychopathy is a more severe form or variant of antisocial personality disorder. Right, so that's Cape Fear in a nutshell. And Jerry's dream is his worry that his uncle actually has this condition. Now, in both cases, the illness called antisocial personality, as well as the condition of psychopathy, the individual may adopt a behavior that we see Uncle Leo demonstrate in the episode. What actually does Uncle Leo describe to Jerry when Jerry catches him stealing the book?
He's definitely manipulative in like the fact that he takes advantage of the fact that he's an older man and can plead confused or, unaware of what he's doing.
That's exactly right. Anybody want to guess the clinical term used to describe that specific manipulation that Uncle Leo describes? Malingering, right? He is feigning major neurocognitive disorder, right? So major neurocognitive disorder, previously known as dementia, is a condition defined through cognitive deficits. Individuals with this condition have several cognitive deficits or deficits in 2 or more cognitive domains that are clinically significant. The course and the progression helps differentiate it from a similar condition, at least per a slice of time, called delirium, in which the onset is slow and it is progressive. Delirium, on the other hand, is acute in onset and fluctuating. But that's major neurocognitive disorder. Now, very quick background, just so you can get the checklist. Dementia or major neurocognitive disorder is a condition we usually introduce through a Stephen King novel called Duma Key. I'm not going to get into the novel in any real depth, but Duma Key highlights a character, Edward, who sustains a significant traumatic brain injury when a crane falls on him, right? He's the owner and operator of a construction company, self-made millionaire, and during work, there is a significant accident resulting in traumatic brain injury, or TBI. He survives the incident. Unfortunately, he has severe neurocognitive deficits and is diagnosed with dementia by Stephen King, right? Major neurocognitive disorder, secondary to TBI. He retires and he convalesces for the rest of his life on an isolated island in the Florida Keys called Duma Key. So I'm not going to get into the actual story anymore. Certainly some very, very concerning things begin to happen in his new home. But Edward Fremantle should be your fictional case, and you can look it up on Wikipedia. It has not been adapted to film. But never forget how he sustained, or what the etiology is of his major neurocognitive disorder. It's a crane accident. And the acronym CRANE, C-R-A-N-E, will be helpful with regard to remembering those different cognitive domains. 2 or more rule in for the condition. So that would include communication, such as language. That would include recall, which is a required deficit. So it's recall plus any of the others. A is activity, so difficulty with motor tasks, activity. And that has to include the individual actually having normal motor function, so it can't be due to a myopathy. N is naming objects. Naming objects. That's why we ask people who are confused to name a pencil and a watch. And the E is executive functioning, being able to plan, executive functioning. So CRANE, those are your DSM diagnostic criteria for major neurocognitive disorder. One other thought about this illness, it has a milder form, and it's actually called mild neurocognitive disorder. And one of the reasons why I want to bring this up is beyond the obvious, which is that it is a milder form, hence the name. The word mild is operationally defined by the individual demonstrating cognitive deficits that are not clinically impairing. And we only see this one other time in the entire DSM, that is a disorder that is actually defined through not being clinically impairing. So to differentiate between major neurocognitive disorder, the milder form is operationalized by there not being functional impairment. If there is any functional impairment, what you think might be just mild should be diagnosed as major neurocognitive disorder. By the way, what is the other illness in the DSM other than mild neurocognitive disorder that is literally defined through its not being clinically impairing? It's hypomania. Right? Hypomania's differentiation from mania is both quantitative as well as qualitative. Quantitatively, it is not 7 days. Mania is. Qualitatively, it is not clinically impairing. Mania is. So if an individual is presenting to you in a full-blown manic-like episode and they've been demonstrating behavior for 3 days, your medical opinion should be that this is likely mania. If we wait long enough, it is likely mania due to the fact that there must be intervention, or it is my medical opinion to intervene at this time because of functional impairment, right? In the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association notes that mania must be 7 days or there must have been intervention. So in someone with a full-blown manic episode who is demonstrating signs and symptoms of mania for 6 days and 23 hours who then gets treatment, you're diagnosing mania. Okay? You're not going to really look at that 7-day marker, that threshold, as written in stone. Right? So hypomania, both quantitative as well as qualitative, and that qualitative difference is shared. And with the neurocognitive disorders, it's self-differentiating, mild from major neurocognitive disorder. But you know what? For Uncle Leo, this is not even a question. He has neither, right? He is absolutely verbalizing to his nephew that he is faking it. And he's faking it for a reason that's an external incentive. And because of that, he's going to be diagnosed with malingering. And malingering in this case may be in the context of a larger disorder, at least through Jerry's perception, called antisocial personality disorder, if not psychopathy.
Dr. Tobia, I thought it was interesting that Jerry's parents remarked how he had priors, which would lead me to think that maybe there was a bit of a history of some of this like antisocial behavior.
Could be. It could be. One of the questions we would ask the collaterals, one of the questions we would ask the Seinfelds is, are those priors prior to age 15? And what do they consist of? They made a comment that it was a moment of lust or a crime of lust. I actually forget their exact words. It suggests that that Leo was older than 15, but that's a valid question, but one we would have asked anyway. But now at least we know who to ask, right? We're going to ask his sister and his brother-in-law about these priors. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? All right, we're going to leave it here. We're coming up, or we're at the half past the hour. What I just want to leave you with as a teaser for today's noon lecture, our noon presentation, is the subplot of Elaine Bennis and what she has to endure. And the observation of what she actually endures is going to inform us about, or at least support what Sleeping Beauty is really about. So we'll leave that there and look forward to rounds in about, let's say 30, 45 minutes. And we will then prep and return for our 12 noon lecture, What Ails Aurora? The case study of Sleeping Beauty. Thank you.